I thought it would be a sweet little surprise, something playful that would make my son laugh and remind him of the bond we've always had. So I slipped quietly into the backseat of his car while he was still inside the house, giggling to myself like a teenager, holding my breath as I crouched low, imagining his shocked face when he'd open the door, start the engine, and I'd suddenly pop up, saying, "Gotcha!" But the longer I waited in that cramped silence, the more my heart pounded with this nervous excitement, until the front door finally opened, his footsteps echoed closer, and the car shook slightly as he slid behind the wheel. Not alone, but with someone else easing into the passenger seat beside him, a presence that immediately changed the air, pulling every trace of joy out of my chest. And as I slowly lifted my head, just enough to glimpse through the gap in the seat, I froze. Because the person sitting next to my son was the last one I ever expected to see. The one face that made my stomach twist into ice. My first instinct was to think my eyes were playing tricks on me, that maybe in the half-light I was confusing features. But no, the tilt of the chin, the painted nails gripping her phone, even the perfume I could smell over the faint scent of my son's cologne. It was unmistakable. She had no business being there. For years she had been the shadow in our family, a figure I had worked hard to erase from our lives, someone I told myself would never cross paths with my son again. And yet here she was, sitting inches away from him, smiling in that same practiced way, leaning close enough that her hair brushed his arm as if it was the most natural thing in the world. My chest tightened until it hurt, because it wasn't just the betrayal of seeing her there. It was the way my son looked at her, relaxed, trusting, like he had no idea of the history between us. He started the engine, oblivious to the storm brewing in the back seat, and I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from making a sound. Every instinct screamed at me to jump out, to shout, to demand answers, but I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I sat frozen, watching their reflection in the rearview mirror, listening as she laughed softly and called him by a nickname only I used to use. My throat burned with the words I wanted to throw at them both, but I knew if I exposed myself too soon, I'd lose the one thing I still had: knowledge. So I stayed hidden, memorizing every detail, every word, every gesture, because whatever game she was playing, I was going to end it. Not today, not in this car, but soon. Very soon. They drove off, the sound of tires crunching against gravel filling the silence between her laughter and his responses, and I clung to every word like it was evidence in a trial. She asked him about classes, about his future plans, and when he answered, I caught a glimpse of how proud he sounded, how eager he was to share himself with her. And it made my stomach twist even tighter, because she hadn't earned that. She hadn't earned him. She was the kind of woman who built herself out of lies, out of manipulation. And if my son only knew the damage she had left behind years ago, the way she tore lives apart like threads from an old sweater, he wouldn't have been sitting there, grinning at her like she was some kind of safe harbor. My nails dug into the leather seat as I thought of the countless nights I had comforted him, teaching him to trust, to love, to stand tall, and now all of that was being siphoned off into the hands of a woman who thrived on taking what wasn't hers. They stopped at a light and she reached out, placing her hand gently on his arm, and he didn't pull away. Instead, he smiled. That smile cut through me like glass. I'd promised myself years ago that she would never get close to my family again, that I would shield him from her poison. And now, here she was, slipping back in like a thief through an unlocked door. I felt the anger swell, rising up past the fear, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about me watching from the shadows. It was about strategy. She thought she was clever, thought she'd walked right back into our lives unnoticed. But she didn't know that I was there, sitting inches away, cataloging every detail of her approach. And my son didn't know he was playing with fire, but I did. I would let her think she was winning, let her weave her little web, and when she was convinced she had us, I would tear it apart strand by strand. Because I wasn't just his mother, I was the woman who already knew her every move. And she had no idea I was back in the game. The car kept moving through familiar streets, each turn etching a deeper weight into my chest. And I realized they weren't just aimlessly driving, they had a destination. My son hummed along softly to the music, completely at ease, while she leaned in closer, whispering something that made him laugh out loud, the sound so genuine it almost shattered me. That laugh had always belonged to me, to our inside jokes, to years of raising him alone. and now it was being poured into her hands like it was hers to claim. When they pulled up outside a cafe, my heart nearly stopped. It wasn't just any cafe, it was the one where I used to take him after school, where he did his homework while I sipped coffee, where we carved our own little rituals into the corners of that place. Now she was walking him through the same door, retracing my footsteps as if she had the right. I stayed in the car, crouched low, trembling with rage and disbelief, but my eyes never left them through the window. I watched as they sat at our table by the glass, as she leaned in with that practiced softness, pretending to listen deeply, touching her chin, nodding in all the right places. I saw my son's shoulders relax, saw him open up, saw him smile that wide, unguarded smile that meant he trusted her. And that was when I understood the gravity of it all. This wasn't some fleeting encounter, some casual meeting. This was a calculated return. She had embedded herself back into his world, step by step, using the same places, the same routines, even the same words I had once used, as though she were rewriting history with herself in my place. It was more than just betrayal. It was invasion. And in that moment, I stopped being afraid of being discovered in the back seat. I stopped worrying about the shock of my son finding me there. I shifted into something colder, sharper. If she wanted to play at being part of his life again, then I would be the one to show her how dangerous it was to steal from me, because she had taken the one person I vowed to protect. And now, whether she knew it or not, she had declared war. I pressed myself lower into the seat, waiting, watching, forcing myself to breathe evenly, while every nerve in my body screamed to storm inside and drag him away from her. But I didn't. I couldn't. A scene would only push him further into her arms, make me look irrational, controlling, the very image she would be delighted to paint of me. So I waited. I studied them through the window as though I was gathering evidence. And in truth, I was. She laughed too loudly at his jokes, tossed her hair the way she always did when she wanted to look irresistible, and every gesture was a performance I had seen her perfect before. I remembered the trail of destruction she had left last time. The broken promises, the debts, the lies spun so tight they strangled trust itself. I remembered the nights I spent cleaning up after her chaos, piecing together what was left of my family. And I knew this wasn't coincidence. She was using my son as her newest pawn, her next victim, and he was too innocent to see it. My jaw ached from clenching as I pulled out my phone and started snapping pictures, her leaning in close, her hand brushing his oblivious smile, images that told a story clearer than words ever could. If he wouldn't believe me on trust, then I would have proof. The truth documented in real time. I sat there for nearly an hour, documenting everything, each photo another nail in the coffin of her lies. When they finally stood to leave, I slouched down quickly, holding my breath as they passed within feet of the car. My son's laughter rang out again, and she tucked her arm lightly against his, steering him toward the door like she belonged there. I gripped my phone tighter, feeling the weight of the evidence in my hand. She thought she was weaving herself back into our world undetected. But what she didn't know was that every step she took, I was right behind her, watching, recording, preparing. She had blindsided me once, but never again. This time she wouldn't see me coming until it was too late. I waited until the clink of their cups and the scrape of chairs faded before I let myself move, slipping from the car like a shadow and following them at a cautious distance, because confrontation in public would only hand her the script she wanted. Me, hysterical, irrational, desperate. And I had learned the hard way that the quieter my steps, the harder my strike would land later. I trailed them back through the market streets, watching how she mapped their route, how she remembered the bench where my son used to hide coins under the slats, how she steered conversation toward memories I had thought were private, and every time she mentioned a detail only someone who had been close to him would know, my skin crawled because she was mining our past, the same way a thief checks a house for hidden safes. When they paused at the little bookshop I used to drag him to as a kid, she leaned in and asked him about a teacher I had fought for, and he answered with that easy trust that had always been my compass. And I realized she was building more than intimacy. She was building credibility in his world, tiny deposit after tiny deposit, until one day he'd consider her indispensable. I stayed invisible while she introduced herself to the owner like they were old friends, slipped business cards into pockets, made sure the owner saw her laugh and remember her name. And when they left, she had baked herself into the neighborhood's memory. That's when I moved from photographer to architect. I started to reconstruct her trail. I Googled her name from a cafe corner, piecing together a pattern: dismissed jobs, friendly legal notices, a string of men who'd bounced from her orbit with quiet bankruptcy and louder apologies. I found a name of a company she'd used as a front, an address that matched the postbox on her card, and a forum where a woman had written, "She took my savings. Beware." My hands shook as I printed the posts, the receipts, the old rental agreements, paper I could hold up to a judge or to a bank or to my son if I needed him to see the truth outside of my voice. I hired a private investigator under the pretense of checking alumni records, and within 3 days I had texts she'd sent before I even knew about her return, carefully edited messages promising stability, photos staged with borrowed cars and rented apartments. Everything curated to look like a life rebuilt, when in reality, it was a stage set for her next act. With every new file I collected, my anger cooled into something sharper, a plan with edges. I couldn't simply tell my son, because warnings from me would sound like jealous history. I needed objective collapse, paper, dates, witnesses. So I began to lay bait. I let her believe the neighborhood had embraced her, fed small rumors to the bookshop owner about a wedding she was organizing, slipped claims to the cafe manager about her investment in a local tutoring program, and watched as she widened her smile, thinking she'd secured allies. Next, I arranged for a casual meetup that looked innocent, a community charity drive where parents donated used textbooks. I volunteered to bring boxes and made sure the organizer knew to invite her and my son. I also made sure my investigator was there with his notepad, the cafe owner had agreed to keep an eye out, and a retired neighbor I trusted would sit on the second row with a clear view. The night before, I sat at my kitchen table, stacks of photos, a printed timeline, a list of names, and I rehearsed calm lines, questions that sounded curious, not accusatory, how to nudge my son without cornering him, how to let the facts speak for themselves. I thought of all the nights I'd read to him until he fell asleep, of the scraped knees I'd kissed, of the tuition bills I'd cobbled together while working double shifts, and I felt a fierce, quiet mercy. I wasn't trying to ruin a life. I was untangling a lie before it tightened around him. When the morning of the drive arrived, I woke with the peculiar steadiness that happens right before something inevitable. I would expose her not with theatrics, but with archives, messages with dates, bank transfers traced to her name, witnesses ready to testify about the pattern she'd left behind. And I would give my son the truth as gently as possible. He deserved to choose with all the facts in his hands, not under the influence of a woman who'd perfected the art of rewriting other people's stories. The charity drive bustled with the sound of cardboard boxes sliding across tables, children darting between stacks of donated books, and neighbors calling greetings over the hum of conversation. And I walked in carrying my box like any other volunteer, my face calm, my voice light, my heart steady even as I spotted them near the registration desk, my son unpacking a small stack of textbooks, and her beside him, too polished for the occasion, in a dress chosen to make her look like she belonged when every detail screamed calculated. She touched his shoulder as though she were claiming space in his life, and I felt the same sick twist I had felt in that car, but this time I didn't flinch or hide. I moved among the tables, setting my donations down, exchanging greetings, and let my eyes brush over to the investigator standing near the entrance, notebook in hand as though he were simply taking notes for the community paper, while my neighbor gave me a subtle nod from the second row of chairs. Everything was in place. The first test came quickly. She introduced herself to one of the coordinators, spinning a story about how she and my son were planning future projects together, slipping in phrases like our community investment and our tutoring initiative that I knew were complete fiction because I had planted those rumors deliberately, breadcrumbs to see how quickly she would claim them as her own. My phone buzzed in my pocket, an incoming email from the investigator, and though I didn't open it immediately, I knew what it contained. Screenshots of her using the same recycled lines in 3 different towns over the past 5 years. I sat down beside my son under the pretense of sorting donations, smiled at him the way I always did, and asked softly how classes were going. His face lit up. He told me about a project he was proud of, and I listened, anchoring myself in that bond, reminding myself why I was doing this. Then she leaned over, inserting herself into the conversation, saying she had been helping him with his research, and I almost laughed because I knew exactly how she helped, by parroting information from others and dressing it as her contribution. The moment to strike came not with fireworks, but with paper. I pulled a folded printout from my bag, an old news clipping about one of her projects in another town that had ended in debt collectors and closed doors, and slid it across the table casually, as if I were showing my son a recipe. "Doesn't she look familiar?" I asked lightly. His eyes scanned the page, his brows furrowing, and before he could speak, she reached for it, her hand trembling just slightly, her voice too smooth as she said, "That's a mistake, a misunderstanding." But my son kept reading, and the more he saw, the more her voice cracked. Around us, the hum of the drive went on as normal, but at that table it was silence and evidence, truth against performance. I leaned back, calm, and said the line I had rehearsed in the quiet of my kitchen. "People can tell you stories, but paper remembers." Her face drained of color as my son's eyes darted between the page and her, confusion rippling across his expression in waves. And for a fleeting moment, I saw the boy he once was, the one who used to look at me when he couldn't solve a puzzle, searching for the missing piece. And I knew this was the moment she feared most, being stripped of her narrative, cornered by facts she couldn't charm her way around. She started talking fast, layering excuses about mistaken identity, old enemies spreading lies, about how everyone makes mistakes, and how she had changed. But her voice wobbled at the edges, and the more she spoke, the more desperate her words became, until my son raised his hand gently and said, "Stop." The single word silenced her like a blade. He turned to me then, eyes still clouded with doubt but sharper than before, and asked, "What else?" That was my opening. Without theatrics, without anger, I pulled out a slim folder from my bag. Receipts, bank transfers, printouts of conversations, each stapled neatly, a timeline of her games across years, and placed it in front of him like I was handing over class notes. He leafed through slowly, the noise of the room fading into background static, and each page shifted his shoulders a little lower, his jaw a little tighter. She tried to snatch the folder, but I slid it farther toward him, my hand steady, my gaze never leaving hers. "If it's all lies," I said evenly, "then he deserves the chance to see them for himself." For a long moment, the three of us sat locked in that strange silence while laughter and chatter filled the air around us. And I felt the weight of the years pressing down, all the scars of her past deceptions layered over the boy I had raised into a man. Finally, my son pushed the folder back toward me, closed his eyes, and whispered, "I need air." He stood, walked outside, leaving her alone with me at the table. She didn't smile now, didn't toss her hair or play at innocence. She leaned across the table, eyes narrowed, voice a low hiss only I could hear. "You think you've won? He's old enough to choose, and you can't watch him forever." I didn't flinch, didn't rise to her venom. I only said, "I don't need to watch him forever. I only need him to see you once for who you are." Her nails clicked against the table as she pushed back her chair, storming toward the exit, and I sat still, heart pounding but steady, because I knew the seed had been planted. The image she had built so carefully was cracking, and this time I wasn't just hoping for the best. I had built the walls myself, brick by brick, with paper and truth. I stayed seated as the door swung shut behind her, the cool draft from outside brushing my face like a quiet confirmation that the storm was passing. And for the first time since I had crouched in that car seat, I allowed myself to exhale fully, steady and unbroken. A few minutes later, my son returned, his face pale, his phone clutched tightly in his hand, and he didn't sit immediately. Just stood there looking at me as though trying to piece together two worlds, the one she had painted for him and the one I had revealed. Finally, he lowered himself into the chair, slid the phone across the table, and I saw the message thread open on the screen, her frantic texts flooding in already. Excuses piling on top of denials, promises that she'd explain everything if only he'd meet her alone. He didn't say much, only muttered, "She never stopped lying, did she?" And I shook my head gently, my voice even. "No, she didn't." We sat there in silence, the folder between us, his phone buzzing every few seconds with her desperate attempts to reel him back in, until he finally switched it off and whispered, "Thank you for showing me before it was too late." Those words cut deeper than anything, not because they were dramatic, but because they were quiet, real, the kind of acknowledgement I had been waiting years to hear. I didn't gloat, didn't press him to say more. Instead, I let the moment breathe, let him process on his own terms. Outside the window, I caught a glimpse of her pacing across the street, scanning the glass with wild eyes, waiting for him to come out. And for the first time, she looked small, powerless, stripped of her performance. She saw me watching her, and in that instant, our eyes locked. I didn't raise my voice, didn't move my lips, but the message was clear. We're finished here. My son gathered his things, closing the folder carefully, almost reverently, and when we left together, she tried to step forward, but he turned his back without a word. I walked beside him, not leading, not pushing, just matching his stride. That night, when we returned home, he placed the folder on the kitchen counter like a boundary marker, an artifact of everything that had almost gone wrong. He didn't need a lecture, didn't need more warnings. He had seen enough. And as I watched him retreat into his room, safe within the walls I had fought to preserve, I felt something I hadn't in years. Not just relief, but a profound, quiet victory. Not the kind won with shouting matches or courtroom drama, but with patience, with proof, with the knowledge that no matter how hard she tried to rewrite our story, the truth had already been etched too deep to erase. In the days that followed, silence became my greatest ally. She tried every angle, flooding his phone with apologies, long messages filled with half-truths, and twisted tales of how jealous people had always conspired against her, of how the world misunderstood her brilliance. She even slipped a handwritten letter into our mailbox, scrawled in dramatic loops, promising redemption if only he'd give her one more chance. But my son didn't answer, didn't write back, didn't even open the letter beyond the first few lines before tossing it onto the counter like trash. He was quieter than usual, yes, but there was a new firmness in him, a boundary finally drawn where there had once only been trust. I watched him sit at his desk, headphones in, focusing on his projects, pouring his energy into the life he was building for himself rather than the illusions she had dangled in front of him. And every time my phone buzzed with an unknown number or an email slipped into my inbox with her name attached, I filed it neatly into the growing archive. Because if she thought persistence would wear me down, she had underestimated how much stronger I had become since the last time she tore through our lives. I wasn't a woman running on fear anymore. I was a strategist, and I had already won the moment my son saw her mask crack. Still, I knew her well enough to expect a final act, some last desperate attempt to reinsert herself into his world. And I was right. A week later, she appeared outside his university, waiting by the gates, trying to catch him off guard. But she wasn't prepared for what happened next. He didn't go alone. He walked out with 2 friends at his side, laughter on his lips, his shoulders squared. When she called his name, that familiar syrupy tone coating every syllable, he turned, but instead of stepping toward her, he raised his voice just enough for others nearby to hear. "Don't contact me again. It's over. Simple, final, and unshakable." She froze, stunned that her script had been ripped from her hands so bluntly, and for the first time in years, I saw her stripped of control, exposed in the daylight with no audience left to manipulate. She turned on her heel, disappearing into the crowd, and that was the last time she tried to face him directly. My son came home that evening quieter than usual, but when he set his bag down, he looked at me and said, "You were right to stay calm. She would have twisted it all if you hadn't had proof." He didn't hug me, didn't need to. We weren't a family built on theatrics. But his words were enough. Proof that the line between us was unbroken, that no matter how carefully she had tried to wedge herself in, she hadn't succeeded. From that moment on, life began to settle into a new rhythm. He studied, he laughed, he built his own friendships, and I finally allowed myself to sleep at night without waiting for the phone to buzz with her chaos. I knew she was still out there, drifting toward her next mark, but it no longer mattered. She had lost her hold on us, and in losing that, she had lost the one thing she valued most: control. Weeks turned into months, and her name became nothing more than a faint echo, a shadow that no longer reached into our home. The folder of evidence stayed tucked away in the drawer of my desk, untouched but never forgotten, a reminder of how close she had come to rewriting my son's story, and how close I had come to losing him to her lies. But now, when I heard his laughter from the next room, it carried no undertones of doubt or manipulation. It was pure, his own, and I let it wash over me like sunlight after years of storm. I realized then that revenge hadn't been about destroying her. It had been about protecting him, about drawing a line she could never cross again. She had thought she could slither back into our lives unnoticed, that history could be erased, but she underestimated the power of memory, of truth, of a mother who refused to be silenced. And as I stood at the window one evening, watching him walk down the street with his friends, head high, shoulders relaxed, free from her shadow, I whispered to myself the words I had earned the right to say, "She can haunt someone else's story now. Ours is no longer hers to touch."